At some point yesterday morning, inside the sprawling Fujairah Oil Industry Zone on the eastern coast of the United Arab Emirates, the air raid sirens went off for the first time in nearly a month. The ceasefire had held for 27 days. No Iranian missiles over Dubai, no drone alerts over Abu Dhabi. The Gulf had been quiet, tense. Economically crippled, diplomatically frozen, but quiet. And then Iran fired for cruise missiles at the way. 3 were intercepted. 1 was not. And the facility that caught fire, the facility that an Iranian drone struck and set ablaze, the facility where 3 Indian nationals were moderately injured and where emergency crews raced to contain flames visible from miles away was not a random target. It was not a military base. It was not an American installation. It was the Fujairah Oil Industry Zone, the terminus of the 380-kilometer Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline. The one pipeline the way built specifically, deliberately, and expensively to route its oil to sea without going through the Strait of Hormuz. The bypass, the alternative, the single most important piece of infrastructure in the entire Gulf that did not depend on the waterway Iran has been holding hostage for 66 days. Iran just bombed the bypass. And that happened on the same day that Iran's Navy, according to Iranian state media, fired missiles and drones at 2 US-guided missile destroyers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The same day that a South Korean-operated vessel caught fire after an explosion in the waterway. The same day that U.S. gas prices hit $4.46 per gallon. Nationally, the highest in nearly 4 years. The same day that Brent crude surged 5% to $114 a barrel. The same day that President Trump's own CENTCOM commander couldn't tell reporters whether the ceasefire with Iran was still intact or not. This is May 5, 2026, day 66 of the Iran war. And what happened yesterday may have changed this conflict more fundamentally than any single day since the naval blockade began. Welcome to Dr.elena.murphy. If you're new here, this channel is your deep dive source for the military, geopolitical, and economic stories that are reshaping the world. And what you're about to hear is the most complete breakdown of yesterday's events that you will find anywhere. The real military results of Project Freedom's first day. What Iran targeting Fujairah the bypass actually signals about Tehran's strategy. Why the USS Truxtun and USS Mason faced what officials called a sustained barrage and why neither was hit. Why markets are now betting $5 gas is, in the words of Eurasia Group's senior Iran analyst, quote, basically baked in, and what Trump's scheduled visit to Beijing next week has to do with every single one of these calculations. Make sure you are subscribed right now. Hit that button before we go further because this story is moving every single hour and yesterday produced more consequential developments than any day in weeks. Let's go. Let's start with Project Freedom's actual Day 1 results because the gap between what the U.S. government declared and what independent analysts concluded tells you everything you need to know about how far this crisis is from resolution. CENTCOM Admiral Bradley Cooper held a press conference on Monday and called Day 1 a success. His exact language, as a first step, 2 US-flagged merchant vessels have successfully transited through the Strait of Hormuz and are safely headed on their journey. He confirmed that U.S. forces employed ballistic missile defense-capable destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms operating above, across, and beneath the water, and 15,000 service members all to protect the movement of those 2 ships. 2 ships through a waterway that before February 28 saw 120 to 160 vessels transit every single day. Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, speaking on CNN's Anderson Cooper 360, called the first day of Project Freedom a tactical success, but said it must be measured against that pre-war flow of 120 vessels a day. Iran just needs to continue to present a perception of risk to keep merchant traffic too small. Numbers, she said, essentially keeping Hormuz all but closed. Commercial confidence is really the center of gravity, Gibson said. Let me translate that into plain English. The U.S. deployed the military equivalent of a sledgehammer to move 2 ships. The pre-war normal was 120 ships moving every day without any military escort at all. 2 compared to 120 is not a reopened strait. It is a demonstration. It is a proof of concept, and Iran responded to that demonstration by making the concept significantly more expensive. Here is what actually happened to those 2 destroyers, the USS Truxtun and the USS Mason, during that transit. Because this is the part that every headline understated. The USS Truxtun and USS Mason, supported by Apache helicopters and other aircraft, faced a series of coordinated threats during the passage. Iran launched small boats, missiles and drones against them in what officials described as a sustained barrage. Despite the intensity of the attacks, neither U.S. vessel was struck, military officials confirmed that defensive measures, bolstered by air support, successfully intercepted or deterred every incoming threat. A sustained barrage, missiles, drones, small boats, against US Navy-guided missile destroyers. On day one of a mission that Trump announced as a humanitarian gesture, Iran said that it launched missiles towards a U.S. warship to stop it entering the strait, and two missiles had struck a U.S. Navy destroyer. The U.S. denied Iranian missiles hit a military vessel during the effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So we have Iran claiming hits, the U.S. denying hits, and both sides agreeing that Iran fired on US Navy warships during a ceasefire. There is no interpretation of that sentence that ends with the ceasefire intact. U.S. forces hit 6 Iranian small boats during the operation. CENTCOM confirmed it. 6 boats sunk. A Maersk subsidiary vessel did transit the strait under US protection, confirming the military corridor was functional. But the scale problem remains total. A shipping industry that needs 120 vessels a day to function normally moved. 2 under combat conditions with 15,000 service members, 100+ aircraft, guided missile destroyers, and Apache helicopters. At this point, the market is betting Project Freedom will not unlock the vast amount of energy trapped in the Middle East. The market's verdict, not mine. The market's. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, make sure you are subscribed to Dr.elena.murphy and have your notifications turned on. We cover this story every day with the depth it demands. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Now let me take you to Fujairah. Because of everything that happened yesterday, the attack on the Fujairah Oil Industry Zone is the development that will have the longest tail, and most coverage is burying the strategic significance. Here is what the Fujairah terminal actually is, because this context is essential. The Way built the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, 380 kilometers of pipeline connecting the onshore oil fields near Abu Dhabi to the coast at Fujairah for one specific purpose: to give the Way an oil export route that could not be threatened by an Iranian Hormuz closure. The Strait of Hormuz has become more widely known for being a major oil choke point, providing roughly 25% of the world's oil trade at sea in addition to significant volumes of fuel and fertilizer products. The Way spent years and billions of dollars building the Fujairah route precisely so it would never be held hostage by that reality. The Fujairah port is the terminus of a pipeline the Way built to bypass the Strait of Hormuz and is the Way's only remaining oil export outlet. It sits on the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait, outside Iran's direct control, outside the zone of the dual blockade. It was also the facility that, since the war began, has been handling the surge in Way exports that helped compensate for Hormuz's closure. When the Way's exit from OPEC was announced and Abu Dhabi moved to maximize production, Fujairah was the valve through which that oil flowed to global markets. It was, in the language of energy infrastructure, the most strategically important facility in the entire Gulf that was not inside the contested waterway. And yesterday, Iran struck it. The Emirate of Fujairah said an Iranian drone sparked a large fire at the Fujairah Petroleum Industries Zone and that 3 Indian citizens were moderately injured during the attack. The Way said Iran fired missiles and drones at a major oil port in Fujairah, which lies just beyond the strait. Its location is significant as it's one of the few export routes for Middle East oil that does not need to transit through the critical waterway. While Way officials said 3 of the 4 incoming Iranian munitions were intercepted, a fire broke out at the country's Fujairah Oil Industry Zone following the series of attacks. The site is currently the Way's only remaining oil export outlet. 1 drone got through, 1 was enough to light the bypass on fire. Now think about what this means strategically. For weeks, analysts have argued that Iran's Hormuz closure was being partially offset by alternative routes: Way's Fujairah exports, Saudi Arabia's Yanbu pipeline, Oman's port capacity. The argument was that the world had built enough bypass infrastructure that a full Hormuz closure, while devastating, was not the extinction-level event Iran had once threatened. The bypass routes were the pressure valve. They were why $5 gas hadn't already arrived. They were why the global economic damage, while severe, was not yet catastrophic. Yesterday, Iran deliberately targeted the most important of those bypass routes. It struck the only remaining Way oil export outlet. It sent a message that no alternative, no pipeline, no bypass terminal, no infrastructure built to escape Iranian leverage is out of range. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman condemned Iran's attacks on the United Arab Emirates in a phone call with Way President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan on Monday, according to Saudi state media. Bin Salman said the renewed strikes on the region were unjustified Iranian attacks targeting the sisterly United Arab Emirates and reaffirmed Riyadh's support for Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia's crown prince on the phone to the Way's president, not a statement, a call direct, personal, immediate. The regional coalition that has been watching this war from cautious distance is being pulled closer with every Iranian strike. Way schools shifted to remote learning this week after renewed Iranian strikes targeted the country. The Emirati Ministry of Education said schools and nurseries would operate remotely from Tuesday through Friday out of concern for the safety of students. Not a military base on alert, schools, children. Parents getting notifications that their kids cannot go to school because Iran is firing missiles. The Way intercepted 19 Iranian missiles and drones on Monday alone. That is not a country at the edge of this conflict. That is a country inside it. Now let's look at what this did to global energy markets, because the economic data from yesterday is some of the most alarming we have seen since the war began. Since the Iran war began in late February, the national average price of unleaded gas has risen 49%. Gas hit $4.46 per gallon Monday as oil futures jumped. In some parts of California, unleaded gas soared to more than $7 per gallon on Monday. Brent crude, the world benchmark and a key driver of gasoline prices, jumped 5% to $114 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark, climbed as high as $107.46 a barrel. The price of jet fuel has risen about 65% since the war started, according to data from the Argus US Jet Fuel Index. U.S. gasoline inventories are down 14% and diesel inventories are down 17% since the beginning of February. And here is the sentence from yesterday that every American needs to hear, stated by Gregory Brew, senior analyst on Iran and the energy sector at Eurasia Group, one of the world's most respected political risk firms. The longer this goes on, the higher prices are going to get. There's nothing that can replace Hormuz output, he said. Adding that based on the amount of oil already lost to the market, 5 gas is basically baked in. Basically baked in, that is not a worst-case scenario. That is a baseline projection from a senior analyst whose job is to model these things accurately. Gas was $2.98 a gallon the day before this war started. Yesterday it was $4.46. $5 is, in Brew's assessment, already locked in regardless of what happens next, and that number assumes no further escalation, no second strike wave, no Fujairah being hit harder, no Yanbu pipeline being targeted. The Iran war is now the most expensive event in the American consumer's daily life since the 1970s oil shock, and it is getting worse every week. Now let me take you inside the critical contradiction at the heart of yesterday's U.S. government messaging, because this is the part that tells you exactly how uncertain the situation is. CENTCOM Admiral Cooper was asked directly whether the ceasefire is over. His answer, "I wouldn't go into details of whether the ceasefire is over or not. I think the key thing is for us is we're merely there as a defensive force." The head of US Central Command, the man commanding 15,000 service members in an active waterway where Iranian missiles were just fired at his destroyers, cannot or will not confirm whether a ceasefire is in effect. That is not diplomatic ambiguity. That is a commander operating in conditions where the legal and political framework of the entire operation is undefined. Trump was asked on Hugh Hewitt's conservative radio program whether the ceasefire with Iran was over and whether strikes could resume as soon as Monday night. Trump told Hewitt, "Well, I can't tell you that. You wouldn't if I answered that question. You'd say this man is not smart enough to be president." And then separately, on Fox News the same morning, Trump warned Iranian forces they would be blown off the face of the earth if they attempted to target US ships in the Strait or the Persian Gulf. And then, in the same Fox News interview, he said war with Iran, militarily, was essentially over, while his destroyers were under sustained barrage, while 6 Iranian boats were being sunk, while missiles were flying at the way, while the Fujairah terminal was on fire. That is the gap between the diplomatic messaging of this war and the operational reality of it. And that gap is precisely what Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi addressed directly in a post on X yesterday. "Events in Hormuz make clear that there's no military solution to a political crisis," Araghchi said. "As talks are making progress with Pakistan's gracious effort, the U.S. should be wary of being dragged back into a quagmire by ill-wishers. So should the Way," he added. "Project Freedom is Project Deadlock." Project Deadlock. Iran's foreign minister, not an erg hardliner, not a parliamentary hawk, the man conducting Iran's diplomatic negotiations, publicly named Project Freedom as Project Deadlock. He is simultaneously conducting peace negotiations through Pakistan and issuing rhetorical broadsides against us military operations. This is the fractured, contradictory decision-making architecture of a regime under enormous pressure managing competing internal factions in real time. And now add the dimension that is receiving almost no coverage given how much happened yesterday: Trump's scheduled visit to Beijing next week. Trump's highly anticipated visit to Beijing next week could complicate his decision to resume the war with Iran. He initially delayed the trip from April while the conflict raged. China has called for reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, where much of the energy products it relies upon pass through, arriving in Beijing with the conflict. At best unresolved or at worst raging yet again could place Trump in a weakened position in his talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Think about what that means structurally. Trump is arriving in Beijing within days. China depends on the Strait of Hormuz for roughly a third of its oil imports, the same oil that has been largely blocked for 66 days. The Chinese economy has absorbed enormous strain from this war. The Dow tumbled 557 points yesterday. The S&P 500 fell, Nasdaq fell. Stocks fell Monday as investors tried to parse the uncertainty. Trump needs to walk into Beijing with something. He needs to say the strait is opening, or the deal is close, or American power resolved this. Instead, yesterday he watched 2 of his destroyers come under sustained barrage, watched 6 boats get sunk, watched Fujairah catch fire, and watched gas prices hit a 4-year high on the same day his humanitarian operation went into effect. US crude futures initially dipped Sunday night on the Project Freedom news before reversing course, with West Texas Intermediate climbing as high as $107.46 a barrel. Brent crude jumped 5% to $114 a barrel. The market looked at Project Freedom, looked at the Iranian response, looked at the Fujairah fire, and went up, not down. Markets going up on a war escalation means one thing. The market no longer believes this conflict is moving toward resolution. It believes it is moving toward further disruption. Simon Kay, Global Director of Reinsurance at North Standard, which provides liability insurance for much of the world's shipping fleet, said, "There is no specificity about which countries have asked for this humanitarian mission, nor how this may be coordinated with Iran, if at all." That is the man whose company insures the vessels that would need to move through the strait. He does not know which ships Project Freedom applies to. He does not know how it coordinates with Iran. Without that clarity, his company cannot write the policies. Without the policies, commercial shipping companies cannot send vessels. Without commercial vessels, the strait remains economically closed regardless of how many destroyers are in the water. Now let me show you the 3 scenarios that emerge from everything that happened yesterday, because the next 72 hours will be defined by which path this conflict takes. Scenario 1. Iran controls the escalation dial and diplomacy survives. The strikes on Fujairah and the barrage against US destroyers were a calculated signal, not a full commitment to war resumption. Iran's foreign minister kept diplomatic channels open even as the military fired, the Iraqi Post condemning ill-wishers dragging. Both the US and way into a quagmire was addressed to moderates on both sides. Under this scenario, Pakistan-mediated talks resumed this week with both sides having demonstrated enough strength to claim they did not blink, and Project Freedom becomes a face-saving mechanism for slowly resuming traffic without either side formally conceding. Scenario 2. The Fujairah strike triggers coalition expansion. The way is no longer a bystander. Its schools are closed, its oil terminal is burning, its air defense systems engaged 19 incoming threats yesterday. Saudi Arabia's crown prince called the way president personally, if Iran continues striking Fujairah the bypass. It is essentially telling every Gulf state that neutrality offers no protection. The Gulf Cooperation Council, which has been quietly watching, becomes operationally involved. Saudi Arabia's full military capacity enters the equation. The coalition confronting Iran expands from us, Israel to us, Israel way, Saudi Arabia, and the calculus of the entire conflict shifts. Scenario 3. Trump authorizes the second strike wave before Beijing. The CENTCOM plan for a short and powerful wave of strikes on Iranian infrastructure has been confirmed by 3 sources with knowledge cited by Axios. Trump is heading to Beijing in days. He cannot arrive having watched his destroyers come under fire and having seen the Fujairah bypass go up in flames without a response. The political cost of arriving in China looking like Iran successfully defied Project Freedom is, in Trump's own strategic calculus, potentially larger than the cost of resuming strikes. Under this scenario, the ceasefire ends formally before the week is over, and the second phase of the war begins. What we can say with certainty today, every word sourced and verified, is this. Project Freedom's Day 1 moved 2 ships. Iran fired missiles and drones at 2 US Navy destroyers in what CENTCOM described as a sustained barrage. 6 Iranian boats were sunk. Iran struck the Fujairah Oil Industry Zone, the way's only remaining oil export outlet outside the strait, setting it on fire and wounding 3 Indian nationals. Brent crude jumped 5% to $114. U.S. gas hit $4.46 per gallon nationally. California averaged $6.11, with some counties at $7. U.S. gasoline inventories are 14% below pre-war levels. Diesel is 17% below. Energy experts warn the U.S. is only weeks away from averaging $5 per gallon for gasoline. Nationwide, CENTCOM zone commander could not confirm whether the ceasefire was intact. Trump threatened Iran would be blown off the face of the earth and simultaneously said the war was essentially over. Iran's foreign minister called Project Freedom Project Deadlock while continuing to negotiate through Pakistan. Way schools moved to remote learning. Saudi Arabia's crown prince called Abu Dhabi personally, and Trump is flying to Beijing within days to face Xi Jinping across a table while Hormuz burns and Fujairah smolders. Day 66. The ceasefire that everyone called fragile is being held together by diplomatic thread while the military reality of both sides moves steadily in the other direction. Iran has now demonstrated something that changes the strategic geography of this entire conflict. It is not only willing to fire on us Navy warships during an active ceasefire, it is willing to strike the bypass infrastructure that the world built to survive without Hormuz. Fujairah was supposed to be the exit. Yesterday, Iran set it on fire. That is not a regime negotiating toward a deal. That is a regime communicating that there is no exit it cannot reach, no bypass it cannot burn, no alternative route it cannot threaten. The fortress economy narrative that Iran built over 47 years may be fracturing from the inside, the rial at 1.84 million to the dollar. The central bank governor privately begging for peace, the Security Council counting weeks until domestic unrest becomes inevitable. But a regime that is fracturing from economic pressure and simultaneously striking the way's bypass pipeline is a regime that has not yet decided whether it wants to go out quietly or loudly. And the world paying $114 a barrel, $4.46 at the pump, watching Fujairah burn on live television is running out of patience for either outcome. Subscribe to Dr.elena.murphy right now. Every development Trump's Beijing visit and what he tells Xi, whether Iran strikes Fujairah again, whether the ceasefire formally ends, whether the second strike wave is authorized, and whether Project Freedom moves from 2 ships to 200, we will cover it with the sourcing and the depth this moment demands. Hit the notification bell so you are there the moment we publish. Tell me in the comments after yesterday, after Fujairah burned, after us destroyers faced a sustained barrage, do you believe a diplomatic deal can still be reached before this war enters its next kinetic phase? Or did Iran just burn the last exit?